I was lying in that hospital bed on Christmas Eve, watching the snow fall outside my window, when I realized my family wasn't coming back. They'd left me there 3 days ago after my surgery, promising they'd return after handling a few things at home. That's when I knew I hadn't just lost my health. I'd lost my family too. But 6 weeks later, they got a letter from my attorney that changed everything. What I did next, they'll never see coming, and I never had to say a word. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Sharon Jones, and at 63 years old, I thought I knew exactly who I could count on. I'd raised 3 children as a single mother after my husband Robert died in a construction accident when the kids were still young. I worked double shifts at the textile factory for 15 years, missing school plays and birthday parties, all so Michael, Rebecca, and David could have what they needed. I put them through college by taking out loans against my house, and when they graduated, I felt like I'd finally succeeded at something that mattered. Michael became a financial advisor, married his college sweetheart Patricia, and moved to the suburbs with their twin boy. Rebecca went into marketing, married a lawyer named Greg, and they had a daughter named Emma, who was the light of my life. David, my youngest, became a teacher, married his high school girlfriend Lisa, and they had a son named Tyler. On paper, we looked like the perfect American family. We had Sunday dinners at my house, celebrated every holiday together, and I thought I'd built something solid, something that would last. But life has a way of showing you who people really are when the stakes get high. It started with a routine mammogram in early December. I'd been putting it off for months because I hated going to doctors, but Rebecca kept nagging me about it, so I finally scheduled the appointment just to get her off my back. When Dr. Tinez called me back in for additional imaging, I felt that familiar knot in my stomach, but I told myself it was probably nothing. Women my age get called back all the time. The biopsy came back positive on a Friday afternoon. Invasive ductal carcinoma, stage 2. Dr. Tinez explained it in his calm, professional voice, but all I could hear was the word cancer echoing in my head like a death sentence. He talked about treatment options, surgery schedules, and survival rates, but I was somewhere else entirely, thinking about Robert and how quickly everything had changed when he got sick. I called Michael first because he was the oldest and he lived the closest. His voice went quiet when I told him, and then he said he'd call Rebecca and David to set up a family meeting. We gathered at my house that Sunday afternoon, all of us sitting around the same dining room table where we'd shared thousands of meals. But this time everything felt different. The weight of what we were discussing hung in the air like smoke. Dr. Martinez had recommended a lumpectomy followed by chemotherapy, and he wanted to schedule the surgery for December 22nd. The timing was terrible right before Christmas, but he explained that with this type of cancer, waiting wasn't really an option. The tumor was growing, and every week we delayed was a week we couldn't get back. Rebecca immediately started talking about logistics. She had a big presentation at work the week after Christmas, and Greg's parents were flying in from Phoenix. Could we maybe push the surgery to January? Michael chimed in that Patricia's family was hosting their annual Christmas party, and they'd already committed to bringing the appetizer. David just sat there quietly, turning his wedding ring around and around on his finger like he always did when he was anxious. I listened to them discuss my cancer surgery like it was an inconvenient scheduling conflict, and something cold settled in my chest. But I pushed it down because these were my children, and they were probably just scared. People say stupid things when they're scared. The surgery can't wait, I said firmly. Dr. Martinez was very clear about that. Michael nodded and said they'd figure it out. Rebecca promised she'd take time off work to be there, and David said he'd arrange for a substitute teacher. We talked about recovery time, about who would stay with me, about Christmas dinner and whether we should postpone it. By the time they left, I felt cautiously optimistic. My family would rally around me the way families do. We'd get through this together. The surgery was scheduled for 7 in the morning on December 22nd. I had to be at the hospital by 5:30 for prep, which meant leaving my house in the dark in the cold, with nothing but the clothes on my back and a small overnight bag. Rebecca had volunteered to drive me, and she showed up at my door at 5:15, already dressed and ready to go, her coffee in a travel mug. We didn't talk much during the drive. I was nervous and she seemed distracted, checking her phone at red lights and tapping her fingers on the steering wheel. When we got to the hospital, she walked me to the registration desk, helped me fill out the paperwork and sat with me in the waiting area until they called my name for Priya. "I'll be right here when you wake up," she said, squeezing my hand. "Michael and David are coming later this morning, and we'll all be here for you." I believed her completely. The surgery took longer than expected. What Martinez had planned as a simple lumpectomy turned into something more complicated when they found additional suspicious tissue. He had to remove more of the lymph nodes than he'd originally anticipated, and the procedure stretched from 2 hours to nearly 4. When I woke up in recovery, I was groggy and disoriented, with a drainage tube coming out of my chest and pain medication making everything feel fuzzy and distant. The first thing I looked for was my family. I turned my head slowly, expecting to see familiar faces, but the chair beside my bed was empty. A nurse named Jennifer was checking my vital signs, and when she saw me looking around, she smiled and said, "You're awake. How are you feeling?" "Where are my children?" I asked, my voice hoarse from the anesthesia. Jennifer consulted her chart and said, "Your daughter Rebecca was here earlier, but she had to step out for a phone call. She said she'd be right back." But Rebecca didn't come right back. I lay there for 2 hours, drifting in and out of consciousness, waiting for someone to show up. Every time I heard footsteps in the hallway, I turned my head, hoping to see Michael or David or Rebecca walking through the door. But it was always someone else. Other patients' families, hospital staff, strangers who belonged to other people. When Dr. Martinez came to check on me around 6 o'clock that evening, he looked concerned. "How are you feeling, Sharon? Are you in pain?" "I'm okay," I said, though I wasn't. "Have you seen my family?" He glanced at the empty chair and frowned. "I spoke with your daughter Rebecca earlier. She said she needed to handle something at home, but would be back soon. Haven't they been by since then?" I shook my head, and he squeezed my shoulder gently. "I'm sure they'll be here soon. The surgery went well, by the way. We got clean margins, and the lymph nodes we removed look good. You're going to be fine." But I didn't feel fine. I felt abandoned. Jennifer came back to check on me around 8 o'clock, and I could see the pity in her eyes when she realized I was still alone. She was kind about it, asking if I needed anything, adjusting my pillows, bringing me ice chips when I said my throat was dry. But her kindness only made me feel worse because it highlighted how alone I was. "Would you like me to call your daughter?" she asked gently. I nodded, and she dialed Rebecca's number from the phone beside my bed. I listened to it ring and ring until it went to voicemail. Jennifer tried Michael's number next, then David's. No one answered. "I'm sure they're just busy," Jennifer said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Christmas Eve is always hectic for families." Christmas Eve, I'd forgotten it, was Christmas Eve. In all my worry about the surgery, I'd lost track of what day it was. My family was probably at home, wrapping presents, preparing for Christmas morning with their own children. And here I was, lying in a hospital bed, with tubes coming out of my body, completely alone. The night stretched on endlessly. I couldn't sleep because of the pain and the unfamiliar sounds of the hospital monitors beeping, nurses talking in the hallway, the elevator dinging every few minutes. I kept thinking about Christmases past, about how my house used to be filled with laughter and chaos on Christmas Eve, with my children arguing over who got to put the star on the tree, and staying up too late trying to catch Santa Claus. This Christmas Eve, I was watching the clock on the wall tick past midnight, marking the beginning of Christmas Day, in the loneliest place I'd ever been. Jennifer came to check on me again around 2 in the morning, and I could tell she was worried about me. She'd been working double shifts because other nurses had called in sick, and she looked exhausted, but she still took the time to sit with me for a few minutes. "Do you want to talk about it?" she asked. I shook my head because I didn't trust my voice. If I started talking about how my children had abandoned me on Christmas Eve, I was afraid I'd start crying and never stop. "I have 4 kids," Jennifer said softly. all grown up now. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Scattered all over the country. Sometimes I think they forget I exist until they need something. But family, they're complicated. People don't always show up the way we expect them to. I wanted to tell her that this was different, that my children weren't just busy or forgetful. They'd made a choice. They'd chosen Christmas parties and work presentations and their own comfort over being here with me when I needed them most. But I just nodded and let her think whatever she wanted to think. Christmas morning arrived with the usual hospital routine, nurses changing shifts, breakfast trays rattling down the hallway, the general bustle of a place that never sleeps. I'd been awake for hours, staring at the ceiling and listening to the sounds of other patients' families arriving for Christmas visits. Through my partially open door, I could see children running down the hallway in their Christmas pajamas, carrying balloons and flowers and stuffed animals for their sick relatives. My phone sat silent on the bedside table. Martinez stopped by around 10 o'clock to check my surgical site and remove the drainage tube. He was cheerful and professional, explaining that everything looked good and that I'd probably be discharged later that day. But when he finished his examination and looked around the empty room, his expression grew serious. "Sharon, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me. Do you have someone at home who can help you with your recovery?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. I was supposed to have someone. I was supposed to have three someones actually, 3 adult children who loved me and would take care of me the way I'd taken care of them when they were sick. But the evidence was sitting right there in the empty chair beside my bed. "I'll be fine," I said, which wasn't really an answer. Dr. Martinez sat down in the chair that should have been occupied by my family. "The first few days after surgery are crucial. You're going to need help with basic tasks, bathing, changing your bandages, preparing meals. The pain medication will make you drowsy, and you shouldn't be driving or operating any machinery. Do you understand what I'm saying?" I understood perfectly. I understood that I was going to be alone in ways I'd never been alone before. I understood that the family I'd sacrificed everything to build had crumbled the moment I needed them to show up for me. "I understand," I said. He looked like he wanted to say more, but before he could, my phone finally rang. It was Rebecca, calling from what sounded like a very noisy place. I could hear children laughing and music playing in the background. "Mom! Oh my God. I'm so sorry I haven't called. How did the surgery go? Are you okay?" I looked at Dr. Martinez, who was listening to this conversation with obvious concern, and I felt something shift inside me, something cold and calculating that I'd never felt before. "The surgery went fine," I said calmly. "When are you coming to pick me up?" There was a pause, and then Rebecca's voice became muffled, like she was covering the phone with her hand. I could hear her talking to someone else, but I couldn't make out the words. When she came back on the line, her voice was strained. "Mom, about that, we're actually at Patricia's parents' house right now. The whole family is here, and we're in the middle of Christmas dinner. The kids are having such a good time, and it would be really hard to leave right now. Is there any way you could maybe take a taxi home? We'll reimburse you for it, of course." I felt like I'd been slapped. Dr. Martinez's eyebrows went up, and he was clearly hearing every word of this conversation. "A taxi," I repeated. "I know it's not ideal, but we're kind of stuck here. Michael's car is blocked in by 3 other cars, and David rode with us, so he doesn't have his car either. We could probably figure something out later tonight, but the discharge papers said you'd be released this afternoon, right? And you're feeling okay? So maybe it would just be easier if I hung up the phone." Dr. Martinez was staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. It wasn't pity exactly, but something closer to anger on my behalf. "I take it your ride home just fell through," he said. I nodded, not trusting my voice. "Sharon, I'm going to be very direct with you. Based on what I just heard, I don't think you should go home alone today. I think you should stay here another night, and I think you should call someone else to help you when you do go home." "There isn't anyone else," I said quietly. "What about friends, neighbors, church members?" I thought about it. There were people in my life, but no one I was close enough to call in a crisis. I'd spent so much time focused on my children and grandchildren that I'd let other relationships slide. I had acquaintances, not friends. I had neighbors I waved to, not people I could depend on. "I'll be fine," I said again, but even I didn't believe it anymore. Dr. Martinez made a note in my chart and said he'd arrange for me to stay another night. He also said he'd have the hospital social worker come talk to me about resources for recovery support. The way he said it made it clear that he thought my family's behavior was as unacceptable as I did. After he left, I lay there staring at the ceiling and feeling something I'd never felt before, not just hurt or disappointment, but a kind of rage that started in my chest and spread through my whole body like poison. I'd given my children everything. I'd worked myself to the bone to provide for them, sacrificed my own dreams and opportunities, so they could have theirs. I'd been there for every crisis, every milestone, every moment when they needed me. And when I needed them, they were at Christmas dinner with their in-laws, asking me to take a taxi home from cancer surgery. The social worker who came to see me that afternoon was a middle-aged woman named Carol, who had kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner. She sat in the chair beside my bed and asked me directly about my support system, my living situation, and my plans for recovery. When I told her the truth, that my children were unavailable and I didn't have anyone else, she didn't try to sugarcoat it or make excuses for that. "That's not acceptable," she said bluntly. "You've just had major surgery, you need help and you deserve help. Let me ask you this. Do you have the financial resources to hire private care?" I thought about my savings account, which wasn't substantial but existed. I thought about the life insurance policy Robert had left me, which I'd never touched. I thought about the equity in my house, which I'd built up over decades of mortgage payments. "I might," I said. "Good. I'm going to give you some phone numbers for reputable home care agents. They can provide everything from light housekeeping to medical assistance. It's not cheap, but it might be worth it to ensure you recover properly." She was being professional and helpful, but I could hear the unspoken judgment in her voice. She'd clearly seen this before: elderly patients abandoned by their families, left to fend for themselves during medical crises. It was common enough that the hospital had protocols for it. After Carol left, I spent the rest of Christmas Day making phone calls. I arranged for a home care aide to come stay with me for the first week after my discharge. I contacted a meal delivery service. I hired a cleaning service to come twice a week. I called my neighbor Mrs. Patterson and asked if she could collect my mail and keep an eye on my house. By the time I was discharged on December 26th, I had a support system in place. It was a paid support system, but it was more reliable than my family had proven to be. The home care aide was a woman named Maria, who was probably in her 50s, with gentle hands and a warm smile. She helped me get settled at home, showed me how to change my bandages, and made sure I took my medications on schedule. She cooked simple meals and kept me company during the long quiet hours when the pain medication made me too drowsy to read or watch television. Maria didn't ask about my family, but on the second day when she was helping me shower, she noticed the dozens of Christmas cards on my kitchen counter that I hadn't bothered to open. "Would you like me to open these for you?" she asked. I nodded, and she read them aloud while I rested on the couch. Most were generic holiday greetings from distant relatives and old colleagues, but 3 of them were from my children. Michael's card was signed by his whole family, including a note from Patricia saying they hoped I was feeling better. Rebecca's card had a long handwritten message about how much she loved me and how proud she was to be my daughter. David's card was simpler but included a photo of Tyler in his school Christmas pageant. Maria read each card with the same neutral tone, but when she finished, she looked at me with something like confusion. "These are from your children?" she asked. I nodded. "But they weren't at the hospital with you?" I shook my head. Maria didn't say anything else, but I could see her processing this information. Later that day, while she was preparing my lunch, I heard her talking quietly on the phone in Spanish. I couldn't understand most of what she said, but I caught the word familia several times, and her tone was clearly disapproving. It was Maria who was with me when my phone started ringing on December 28th. Michael called first, then Rebecca, then Dave. They all wanted to know how I was feeling, how my recovery was going, and when they could come visit. They spoke to me like nothing had happened, like abandoning me at the hospital was just a minor scheduling mix-up that we'd all moved past. I was polite, but distant. I answered their questions about my health, but I didn't elaborate. I didn't tell them about the pain that kept me awake at night, or the fear that crept in during the quiet moments when I wondered if the cancer would come back. I didn't mention Maria or the meal delivery service or any of the other arrangements I'd had to make, because they hadn't been there when I needed them. We should all get together for New Year's, Rebecca suggested, maybe have dinner at my house. The kids would love to see you, and we could all catch up. I'm not really up for that yet, I said. Oh, of course, I just thought, well, maybe in a few weeks then, when you're feeling stronger, maybe, I said, but I was already planning something else entirely. That night, after Maria had gone home and I was alone in my house, for the first time since the surgery, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea and a legal pad. I started writing down everything I could remember about the past week, the times I'd called my children and they hadn't answered, the exact words Rebecca had used when she asked me to take a taxi home from the hospital, the Christmas cards they'd sent while I was lying alone in a hospital bed. I wrote it all down because I had a feeling I was going to need it. The next morning, I called my attorney. James Whitmore had been my lawyer for 15 years, ever since I'd hired him to help me navigate the legal mess after Robert's death. He was a few years older than me, with silver hair and a quiet intensity that made people take him serious. He'd helped me with my will, my estate planning, and a few minor legal issues over the years. More importantly, he was someone I trusted completely. Sharon, he said when his secretary put me through, I heard about your surgery. How are you feeling? I'm recovering, I said, but I need to talk to you about something urgent. Can you come to my house? I'm not really up for driving yet. James arrived that afternoon with his briefcase and a concerned expression. He sat at my kitchen table while I told him everything that had happened. The surgery, the hospital stay, the abandonment, the Christmas cards. I showed him the notes I'd written, the bills from the home care agency, the meal delivery receipt. When I finished, he sat quietly for a long moment, processing what I'd told him. Sharon, he said, finally, I've been practicing law for 35 years, and I've seen a lot of ugly family situations, but this is particularly cruel. I need to know what my options are, I said. What kind of options? Legal options, financial options. I need to know what I can do to protect myself. James opened his briefcase and pulled out a yellow legal pad. Tell me about your current estate plan. What does your will look like right now? I walked him through my existing will, which was pretty straightforward. Everything was divided equally among my 3 children, with provisions for my grandchildren if anything happened to Michael, Rebecca, or David. The house, my savings, my life insurance, my retirement accounts, it all went to them. And you want to change that? James asked. I want to change everything, I said. We spent the next 2 hours going through my finances in detail. James was thorough and methodical, asking about every account, every asset, every debt. He took notes on his legal pad, occasionally asking clarifying questions or suggesting alternatives I hadn't considered. When we finished, he looked at me serious. Sharon, before we proceed with any changes, I need to ask you something. Are you doing this out of anger? Or are you doing this because you genuinely believe your children can't be trusted to take care of you if you need them again? It was a fair question, and I thought about it carefully before answering. Both, I said. Finally, I'm angry because they abandoned me when I needed them most, but I'm also scared because I realize I can't depend on them. What if the cancer comes back? What if I have a stroke or a heart attack? What if I need long-term care? I can't trust them to be there for me. James nodded slowly. That's a reasonable concern, and it's certainly grounds for revising your estate plan. What would you recommend? Well, there are several options. You could disinherit them entirely, which would send a very clear message, but might not be in your best interests long term. You could reduce their inheritance, and use the money to establish a trust for your own care. You could set up conditional bequests,
they only inherit if they meet certain requirements. Or you could create a comprehensive care plan that ensures you'll be taken care of, regardless of what they do. I want to hear about all of those options, I said. James spent the next hour explaining the different approaches we could take. He talked about revocable trusts, irrevocable trusts, conditional inheritance, and care agreement. He explained how we could structure things to ensure I'd have resources for medical care, home care, and long-term care if I needed it. The key, he said, is to make sure you're protected first. Everything else is secondary. What about my grandchildren? I don't want to punish them for their parents' mistakes. We can absolutely protect them, James said. In fact, that might be the most powerful leverage you have. If your children know that their behavior affects their children's inheritance, they might be more motivated to treat you properly. By the time James left that afternoon, we had the outline of a plan. He would draft new estate planning documents that would accomplish several things. First, ensure that I had adequate resources for my own care. Second, reduce my children's inheritance to reflect their failure to care for me. And third, create educational trusts for my grandchildren that would be managed independently of their parents. How long will this take? I can have the documents ready for review by the end of next week, James said. But Sharon, I want you to think carefully about this. Once you sign these documents, your children are going to be very upset. Are you prepared for that? I thought about lying alone in that hospital bed on Christmas Eve, listening to other people's families celebrating while mine was at a party. I thought about Rebecca asking me to take a taxi home from cancer surgery. I thought about the Christmas cards they'd sent while I was paying strangers to take care of me. I'm prepared, I said. After James left, I sat in my living room and looked around at the house I'd called home for 25 years. It was filled with memories of my children growing up, height marks on the doorframe, family photos on the mantel, the dining room table where we'd shared thousands of meals. This was the house where I'd raised them, where I'd bandaged their scraped knees, and helped them with homework, and taught them right from wrong.
But it was also the house I'd come home to alone after cancer surgery. The house where I'd had to hire strangers to help me because my own children couldn't be bothered. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found Michael's number. I stared at it for a long time, thinking about calling him, thinking about giving him a chance to explain or apologize or make things right. But then I remembered his voice on Christmas morning, cheerful and oblivious, asking how I was feeling while he was surrounded by his in-laws at a holiday dinner I hadn't been invited to. I put the phone down and went to bed. The next few days passed quietly. Maria continued to come every day, helping me with my recovery and keeping me company. My pain was manageable, and I was getting stronger, but I still felt fragile in ways that had nothing to do with the surgery. I felt like I was walking around with a wound that no one could see, a hurt that went deeper than anything physical. My children called every day, but our conversations were stilted and awkward. They asked about my health, and I gave them brief updates. They talked about their own lives, work, the kids, their plans for the new year, and I listened politely but didn't engage. I could tell they sensed something was wrong, but none of them asked directly what it was. On January 2nd, James called to tell me the documents were ready for review. I asked him to come to my house again, and he arrived that afternoon with a thick folder and a serious expression. "I've drafted everything we discussed," he said, spreading the documents across my kitchen table, "but before we go through them, I want to make sure you understand what you're doing. This isn't just about money, Sharon. This is about permanently changing your relationship with your children." "They already changed it," I said. "I'm just making it official." James walked me through each document carefully. The new will reduced my children's inheritance from everything to a token amount, $5,000 each, which was enough to prevent them from claiming they'd been forgotten accidentally. The rest of my estate would go into a trust that would provide for my care for the rest of my life, with any remainder going to my grandchildren when they turned 25. The trust was structured so that if I needed long-term care, the money would be available for that purpose. If I remained healthy, the funds would be invested and would grow for my grandchildren's benefit. Either way, my children would have no access to the money and no control over my care. There's one more document, James said, pulling out a single sheet of paper. This is a letter of instruction that explains your reasoning. It will be included with the will when it's read. I read the letter carefully. It was factual and straightforward, explaining that my children had failed to provide care and support during my medical crisis, and that I therefore couldn't trust them to make decisions about my welfare or my estate. It mentioned specific dates and incidents, including their absence from the hospital and their request that I take a taxi home from surgery. This will be devastating to them, James said quietly. Good, I said, and I meant. We spent another hour going over the details, and then James asked me to sign each document. As I wrote my name on the signature lines, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks, a sense of control, of agency, of power over my own life. When do you want me to send them copies? James asked. Not yet, I said. I want to wait until I'm fully recovered. I want to be strong enough to handle their reaction. James nodded and gathered up the documents. Sharon, I hope you know what you're doing. I know exactly what I'm doing. For the first time in a long time, I know exactly what I'm doing. After James left, I sat in my living room and felt a strange sense of peace. I'd taken back control of my life and my future. I'd protected myself and my grandchildren, and I'd sent a message to my children that would change everything between us. I just hoped I was strong enough for what came next. 3 weeks passed before my children realized something had fundamentally shifted between us. I was getting stronger every day, thanks to Maria's care and the physical therapy sessions Dr. Martinez had recommended. But emotionally, I felt like I was living in a different world than the one I'd inhabited before my surgery. It was a world where I understood exactly how alone I really was, and strangely, that knowledge felt liberating rather than devastating. Maria had become more than just a caregiver during those weeks. She was someone I could talk to honestly, someone who didn't expect me to pretend everything was fine when it wasn't. She'd raised 5 children of her own in El Salvador before immigrating to the United States, and she had strong opinions about family loyalty that she expressed in careful diplomatic ways. In my culture, she told me one afternoon while she was helping me organize my medications, when a parent is sick, the children take turns staying at the hospital. They bring food, they bring blankets, they sleep in chairs if they have to. The parent is never alone. That sounds nice, I said. It is not just nice, Maria replied firmly. It is necessary. Family is not just for good times. Family is for when everything falls apart. I thought about that conversation later that evening as I sat in my living room, watching the snow fall outside my window. The house felt different now that I was alone in it most of the time, without the constant bustle of family dinners and holiday gatherings. I could hear things I'd never noticed before, the way the old radiator clanked when the heat kicked on, the sound of my neighbor's television through the wall, the tick of the antique clock Robert had given me for our 10th anniversary. But the quiet wasn't oppressive anymore. It was peaceful in a way I hadn't expected. For the first time in decades, I didn't have to worry about anyone else's schedule or needs or expectations. I could eat dinner at 6 or at 9. I could watch whatever I wanted on television. I could go to bed early or stay up late reading without anyone commenting on my choices. The freedom was intoxicating, but it was also tinged with sadness, because I understood now that it had come at such a high cost. I'd lost my children not through death or distance, but through their own choices, their own failures of character. In some ways that felt worse than losing Robert, because at least his death hadn't been a choice. My phone still rang regularly. Michael called every few days to check on my recovery, always sounding cheerful and concerned but never acknowledging what had happened at the hospital. Rebecca called more frequently, usually with news about Emma or updates from her job, chattering away as if nothing had changed between us. David called least often, but when he did, his conversations felt more genuine somehow, though he never directly addressed the elephant in the room either. None of them asked about my care arrangements, none of them offered to help with anything, none of them seemed to realize that I'd had to rebuild my entire support system without them. They talked to me like I was the same person I'd always been, living the same life I'd always lived, just temporarily slowed down by surgery. But I wasn't the same person. The woman who had raised them, who had sacrificed everything for their happiness and success, who had always put their needs before her own, that woman had died in that hospital room on Christmas Eve. The woman who had taken her place was harder, more calculating, more protective of herself. She was someone who understood that love without reciprocity was just enabling, and that family loyalty was a two-way street. It was Maria who first noticed that my children never visited. During her second week caring for me, she asked casually if I expected any family members to stop by that day. When I told her no, she looked confused. "But you live so close to them," she said. "The daughter with the marketing job, she is only 20 minutes away." "Yes, and the son with the twins, he is even closer." "They're busy," I said, using the excuse I'd been telling myself. Maria raised an eyebrow but didn't pursue it. The next day, she brought it up again, more directly this time. "Mrs. Sharon, forgive me for asking, but have your children seen you since you came home from the hospital?" I shook my head. "Have they offered to help with anything? Shopping, cleaning, cooking?" I shook my head again. Maria was quiet for a long moment, and then she said something that hit me like a physical blow. "I am sorry, but this is not normal. Children who love their parents do not behave this way." That night, after Maria had gone home, I called my sister Ellen in Portland. Ellen was 2 years older than me, and we'd grown apart over the years as our lives took different paths, but she was the only person I could talk to who would understand the full context of my situation. She'd known my children since they were babies, had watched me struggle as a single mother, had seen how hard I'd worked to give them everything they needed. "Ellen," I said when she answered the phone, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to be honest with me about what you think." I told her everything: the surgery, the hospital stay, the abandonment, the taxi conversation, everything. Ellen listened without interrupting, occasionally making small sounds of shock or disapproval, but letting me get the whole story out before she responded. When I finished, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Sharon," Ellen finally said, her voice tight with anger, "what they did to you is unforgivable, absolutely unforgivable." Hearing someone else say it out loud, someone who knew my children and had watched them grow up, felt like validation I didn't know I needed. For weeks I'd been questioning myself, wondering if I was overreacting, or being too sensitive or expecting too much. But Ellen's outrage confirmed what I'd known in my heart, that what had happened to me was wrong, deeply and fundamentally wrong. "I've been wondering if I should say something to them," I admitted, "confront them directly about what they did." "What would be the point?" Ellen asked. "They know what they did, Sharon. They chose Christmas parties and holiday brunches over their mother's cancer surgery. They chose convenience over love. Do you really think they're going to apologize or change?" I thought about that question for a long time after we hung up. Did I think they would change? Did I think they were capable of acknowledging what they'd done and making amends for it? Did I think there was any possibility of repairing our relationship? The answer, I realized, was no. They'd shown me who they really were when the stakes were highest, when I needed them most. They'd revealed their true priorities, their true capacity for selfishness and callousness. Even if they apologized now, even if they claimed they were sorry and promised to do better, how could I ever trust them again? How could I ever believe that they wouldn't abandon me the next time I needed them? That realization was liberating in a way I hadn't expected. If there was no possibility of repair, then I was free to do whatever I needed to do to protect myself. I was free to make decisions based on my own needs and interests, rather than trying to preserve relationships that were already destroyed. The next morning, I called James Whitmore and asked him to move forward with sending the documents. "Are you sure?" he asked. "Once I send these, there's no taking them back. Your children are going to know exactly what you've done, and why you've done it." "I'm sure," I said. "Send them today." James agreed to handle the delivery personally, using certified mail to ensure there would be legal proof that each of my children had received their copy. He would send the documents to their home addresses, timing the delivery for a Saturday morning, when they would all be home to sign for them. "The letters should arrive tomorrow," he told me. "Are you prepared for their reaction?" I thought about that question. Was I prepared for angry phone calls, for accusations, for my children to show up at my door demanding explanation? Was I prepared for them to tell me I was being cruel and vindictive? Was I prepared for them to try to turn my grandchildren against me? Yes, I said, I'm prepared. But even as I said it, I wondered if anyone could really be prepared for something like this. I was about to blow up my family in a way that could never be undone. I was about to hurt my children as deeply as they had hurt me, except I was doing it intentionally, strategically, with careful planning and legal documentation. The difference was that they had hurt me through negligence and selfishness. I was hurting them through justice. That Friday evening, I sat in my living room with a cup of tea and tried to imagine what the next day would bring. By noon on Saturday, each of my children would have received a thick envelope from James Whitmore's law firm. They would open it expecting some routine legal matter, maybe an update on my will, or a request for them to serve as executors of my estate. Instead, they would find documents that would change their lives forever. Michael would probably read his copy first, since he was always the most methodical about handling paperwork. I could picture him sitting at his kitchen table with Patricia looking over his shoulder, both of them reading in increasingly stunned silence as they realized what they were looking at. Michael would understand the financial implications immediately. His background in financial planning would make it clear to him just how much money he'd lost through his choices. Rebecca would probably react with anger first, then disbelief. She would call Michael immediately, demanding to know if he'd received the same documents, wondering if this was some kind of mistake or joke. Rebecca had always been the most confrontational of my children, the most likely to fight back when she felt wrong. David would be the most hurt, I thought. He was the youngest, the most sensitive, the one who had always been closest to me emotionally. He would take this as a personal betrayal rather than a logical consequence of his action. He would probably cry, and part of me felt guilty about that, but not guilty enough to change my mind. I went to bed that Friday night feeling calmer than I had in weeks. Tomorrow would bring chaos and confrontation, but it would also bring clarity. My children would finally understand that actions have consequences, that love is not unconditional, that taking someone for granted can cost you everything. Saturday morning dawned clear and cold. I woke up early and made myself breakfast, taking my time with coffee and toast while I watched the sunrise through my kitchen window. Maria didn't work weekends, so I was alone in the house, but that felt appropriate somehow. This was something I needed to face by myself. The first delivery truck arrived at 10:30. I watched through my living room window as it pulled up to Michael's house across town, though of course I couldn't see it from my house, but I knew the schedule James had arranged, and I could track the progress of each delivery in my mind like a countdown to an explosion. Michael's envelope would be delivered first, at 10:30, Rebecca's would arrive at 11:15, David's would be delivered last, at noon. By 12:30, all three of my children would know that their mother had disinherited them, and why. I spent the morning reading, trying to distract myself, but my concentration kept wandering to the clock on the mantel. At 11 o'clock, I imagined Michael opening his envelope. At 11:45, I pictured Rebecca signing for her delivery. At 12:15, I thought about David carrying his envelope inside, probably thinking it was related to my medical bills or insurance paperwork. My phone rang at 12:47. It was Michael, and when I answered, his voice was tight with controlled anger. "Mom, I just received some documents from your lawyer that I need to discuss with you. Can I come over?" "Of course," I said calmly. "I'll be here. I'm bringing Rebecca and David with me." We all received the same thing, and we think there's been some kind of mistake. "There's no mistake," I said. There was a long pause. "We'll be there in an hour." After I hung up, I sat in my living room and tried to prepare myself for what was coming. I'd known this moment would arrive, but now that it was here, I felt a strange mixture of anticipation and dread. I was about to face my children as adversaries, rather than as family, and that felt like crossing a line I could never uncross. But they had crossed that line first, on Christmas Eve, when they left me alone in a hospital bed. They had declared war on our family relationship through their neglect and selfishness. I was just making it official. I changed into a nice dress and put on makeup,
wanting to look strong and composed rather than like an invalid. I made a fresh pot of coffee and set out cups on the kitchen table, falling back on the habits of hospitality, even though this wasn't going to be a social visit. At exactly 1:47, 3 cars pulled into my driveway simultaneously. Through my front window, I watched my children get out of their vehicles and gather on my lawn, conferring in low, urgent voices, before approaching my door. They looked like a delegation coming to negotiate a hostage situation, which in a way I supposed they were. Michael knocked, and I opened the door to find all 3 of them standing on my porch with identical expressions of shock and hurt. Rebecca was holding her envelope like evidence of a crime, and David looked like he'd been crying. "Come in," I said, stepping aside to let them pass. We gathered in my living room, the same room where we'd discussed my surgery 6 weeks earlier, but everything felt different now. Then, I'd been the vulnerable one, the patient seeking support from her family. Now I was the one in control, the one holding all the cards. Michael spoke first, his voice carefully modulated, in the tone he probably used with difficult clients.
Mom, we need to understand what's happening here.
These documents, they don't make sense. There has to be some explanation. What would you like me to explain? I asked. You're disinheriting us, Rebecca said, her voice rising. You're giving everything to the grandkids and leaving us with nothing. How is that fair? I'm leaving you $5,000 each, I corrected. That's not nothing. It's insulting, Rebecca snapped. After everything we've done for you, after all the support we've given you over the years. What support? I interrupted, and my voice was sharper than I'd intended. What support did you give me when I needed it most?
The room fell silent.
David was staring at his hands, and Michael was looking anywhere but at me. Only Rebecca maintained eye contact, though her expression was more uncertain. If this is about the hospital, Michael said carefully, we can explain that. It was a complicated situation, with the holidays and everything. Explain it then, I said. Explain to me how your father's Christmas party was more important than being with your mother after cancer surgery. It wasn't like that, Rebecca said, but her voice lacked conviction. We thought you were okay. The doctor said the surgery went well. We didn't realize you needed us to stay. I spent Christmas Eve alone in a hospital bed, I said quietly. Christmas Day too. Do you have any idea what that felt like? To be lying there in pain, wondering if my cancer was going to come back, watching other people's families visit them while my own children were at parties. David finally looked up and his eyes were wet with tears.
Mom, we're sorry.
We didn't know you felt that way. We thought you thought what? That I would be fine? That I didn't need my family when I was facing the possibility of dying. You weren't dying, Rebecca said defensively. It was a routine surgery. You're being dramatic. The words hung in the air like a slap. Rebecca immediately looked like she regretted saying them, but it was too late. She'd just proven everything I'd written in that letter of instruction. A routine surgery, I repeated, for cancer that I had to recover from alone, because my children couldn't be bothered to interrupt their holiday plans. We would have been there if it was serious, Michael said. But even he didn't sound convinced. How would you have known if it was serious? None of you answered your phone. None of you came to check on me. Rebecca, you asked me to take a taxi home from the hospital. A taxi, after cancer surgery, because you didn't want to leave a Christmas party. Rebecca's face was bright red now. That was a misunderstanding. We were stuck there and we couldn't get away, and you thought your convenience was more important than my safety, I finished, and you were right. From your perspective, your convenience was more important to you than I was. That's not true, David said, his voice breaking. We love you, Mom. You're everything to us. No, I said firmly. I'm not everything to you. I'm not even important to you. I'm just someone you call when you need something, or when it's convenient for you. But when I needed you, where were you? The question hung in the air unanswered, because we all knew the truth. They'd been at parties, and brunches, and family gatherings, that didn't include me. They'd been living their lives as if I didn't matter, and now they were shocked to discover that their actions had consequences. Look, Michael said, switching to his problem-solving voice, Clearly, there's been a breakdown in communication here, but we can fix this. We can work together to resolve these issues and restore the family relationship we all want. What we all want? I asked. Michael, what I wanted was for my children to be with me when I had cancer surgery. What I wanted was for someone to drive me home from the hospital instead of asking me to take a taxi. What I wanted was for my family to actually act like a family when it mattered most. Did I get what I want? Michael didn't answer. This isn't about communication, I continued. This is about character. This is about who you really are when the stakes are high and things get difficult. And you've shown me who you are. So you're punishing us, Rebecca said bitterly. You're taking away our inheritance because we disappointed you once. I'm protecting myself, I corrected, and I'm protecting my grandchildren from parents who think love is conditional and family obligations are optional. What does that mean? David asked. It means that if you can abandon me when I have cancer, what are you going to do to your own children when they need you and it's inconvenient? It means that if you can justify leaving your mother alone in a hospital on Christmas, what other selfish choices are you going to make? It means I don't trust you with money, and I don't trust you with responsibility, and I don't trust you to take care of anyone but yourselves. The words came out harder than I'd intended, but they were true, and saying them felt like releasing pressure that had been building inside me for weeks. You're not being fair, Rebecca said, tears streaming down her face now. We made a mistake, okay? We handled the hospital thing badly, but we're your children, we're your family. You can't just throw us away because we screwed up once. Once? I asked. Rebecca, when was the last time you visited me when you didn't need something? When was the last time any of you called, just to see how I was doing, not because you had news to share or wanted advice or needed me to babysit? When was the last time you treated me like I mattered for my own sake rather than for what I could do for you? None of them answered because they couldn't. We all knew the truth. I raised you better than this, I said quietly. I taught you about loyalty and responsibility and taking care of the people you love. But somehow you learned that those lessons only applied to other people, not to me. We do love you, David insisted. Love is not a feeling, I said. Love is a choice. Love is showing up when it's hard. Love is sacrificing your own comfort for someone else's need. Love is what I did for you every single day, for 30 years. But what you did to me at Christmas, that wasn't love. That was selfishness disguised as love. The room was quiet, except for the sound of Rebecca crying. Michael was staring at the floor, and David was wiping his eyes with his sleeve. They looked like children who had been caught doing something terrible and were finally understanding the magnitude of their actions. But understanding wasn't enough. Understanding didn't change what they'd done or who they'd revealed themselves to be. Understanding didn't give me back Christmas Eve, or the security of knowing my family would be there when I needed them. So what happens now? Michael asked finally. Now you live with the consequences of your choices, I said, just like I've had to live with them. The will can be changed, Rebecca said desperately. You can revise it. We can make this right. How? I asked. How are you going to make Christmas Eve right? How are you going to give me back the feeling of security I used to have in this family? How are you going to convince me that I can trust you to be there for me the next time I need you? She didn't have an answer. The will stands, I said firmly. My decision is fine. What about the grandchildren? David asked. What are we supposed to tell them when they ask why Grandma left everything to them and nothing to us? Tell them the truth, I said. Tell them that family relationships require effort and commitment from everyone involved. Tell them that taking someone for granted can cost you everything. Tell them that love without action is just empty words. You're destroying this family, Michael said, his composure finally cracking. No, I replied. You destroyed it on Christmas Eve.
I'm just making it official. They stayed for another hour, cycling through anger and bargaining and grief as they tried to process what was happening. They threatened to contest the will, then realized they had no grounds. They promised change, then couldn't explain how or why I should believe them. They accused me of being vindictive, then fell silent when I reminded them of what they'd done to earn this response. Eventually they ran out of arguments and emotions and words. One by one, they hugged me goodbye and each hug felt like a funeral for the relationships we used to have. By 4 o'clock, I was alone in my house again, sitting in my living room and looking at the coffee cups they'd left on my table. I felt exhausted, but also relieved. The worst part was over. They knew the truth now, and they knew there was no going back. Whatever happened next, at least there would be no more pretending that everything was fine. My phone rang almost constantly for the rest of the weekend. My children called individually and together, sometimes angry, sometimes pleading, sometimes crying. They sent text messages and emails. Rebecca even showed up at my door on Sunday evening, but I didn't answer when she knocked. I'd said everything I needed to say. The rest was up to them. On Monday morning, Maria returned to work and immediately noticed the change in my demeanor. "You look different," she said, studying my face. "Stronger, maybe. What happened?" "I told my children the truth," I said. "Good," Maria replied with a firm nod. "Truth is always better than pretending." That afternoon, Ellen called from Portland. "I heard from Michael," she said. "He called to ask if I knew what was going on with you, if you were having some kind of breakdown." "What did you tell him?" "I told him that abandoning your mother during cancer surgery is what a breakdown looks like, and that you were the sanest person in the family right now." I laughed for the first time in weeks. "How are you holding up?" Ellen asked. "Better than I expected," I said honest. "It hurts, but it also feels right. Like I finally stood up for myself after years of letting them take me for granted." "Good for you," Ellen said. "It's about time." That evening, as I sat in my living room reading a book I'd been wanting to finish for months, I realized something had fundamentally shifted inside me. The constant anxiety I'd been carrying about my relationships with my children was gone. The worry about whether I was asking too much or expecting too much or being too needy, all of that had disappeared. In its place was a kind of peace I hadn't felt in years. The peace of knowing exactly where I stood, of having clear boundaries, of no longer trying to maintain relationships that had been one-sided for far too long. I'd lost my children, but I'd found myself, and for the first time since Robert died, that felt like enough. The weeks following my children's discovery of the new will passed in a strange rhythm of harassment and silence. Some days my phone would ring constantly with calls from Michael, Rebecca, or David, each trying different tactics to convince me to change my mind. Other days, there would be complete radio silence, and I would wonder if they'd finally accepted the reality of what I'd done, or if they were plotting some new approach. Maria noticed the change in the frequency of my phone calls, and asked about it one Tuesday morning, while she was helping me with my physical therapy exercises. "Your children, they do not call as much now," she observed, counting my arm repetitions. "No, they don't," I agreed. "This is good." I considered the question carefully. "I think so." The constant calling was becoming exhausting. Maria nodded knowingly. "Sometimes people need time to understand that what they have done cannot be undone with words." She was right, but I was beginning to realize that my children might never reach that understanding. Each conversation we'd had since the confrontation followed the same pattern. They would start by trying to rationalize their behavior at Christmas, then move to promises about how they would do better in the future, and finally end with accusations that I was being unreasonable and cruel. None of them had ever simply said they were sorry for abandoning me when I needed them most. It was during this period of relative quiet that I began to understand just how much my life had changed, not just in terms of my family relationships, but in my daily existence. Without the constant obligation to be available for my children's needs, I was discovering parts of myself that had been dormant for years. I started reading again, really reading, not just skimming magazines or newspapers, but losing myself in novels and biographies and books about subjects I'd always wanted to explore. I joined an online book club for people my age, and found myself engaged in discussions about literature and ideas in ways I hadn't experienced since college. I also began taking longer walks around my neighborhood, something I'd never had time for when I was constantly managing family crises and obligations. The exercise was good for my recovery, but more than that, I was noticing things about my community that I'd missed during all the years I'd been rushing between work and family responsibilities. There was Miss Chain next door, who tended an incredible garden and spoke limited English, but always smiled and waved when she saw me. There was the young couple 2 houses down, who were renovating an old Victorian and working on it together every weekend, clearly in love, and building something beautiful together. There was the elderly man at the end of the block who sat on his porch every afternoon reading newspapers and occasionally nodding to passers-by. I realized I'd been living in my neighborhood for 25 years without really being part of the community. I'd been so focused on my children's lives and needs that I'd never invested in relationships with the people who actually lived near me. One afternoon in late January, Mrs. Chen was outside dealing with a package delivery when the delivery driver couldn't find her house number in the snow. I happened to be coming back from my walk and helped translate and direct him to the right address. Mrs. Chen was so grateful that she invited me in for tea, and we spent an hour communicating through gestures and broken English, and somehow understanding each other perfectly. Her house was warm and filled with the smell of herbs and cooking, and she showed me photos of her grandchildren in California who visited twice a year. She had raised 4 children as a single mother after her husband died young, and though we couldn't discuss the details, I could see in her eyes that she understood something about sacrifice and disappointment that my own children never would. When I left her house that afternoon, I felt lighter somehow. I'd made a new connection based on mutual respect and kindness, rather than obligation and guilt. It was refreshing in a way I hadn't expected. That evening Rebecca called, and the contrast between my afternoon with Miss Chen and my conversation with Rebecca was stark. "Mom, I've been thinking about everything that's happened," Rebecca began, "and I really think you need to consider talking to someone, a therapist or counselor. You're making major life decisions based on one bad day, and that's not healthy." "One bad day?" I repeated. "The hospital thing." "Yes, we handled it poorly, but you're acting like we committed some unforgivable crime. We made a mistake, and now you're punishing us for it by destroying our family." I listened to her talk about my overreaction and my inability to forgive, and my unrealistic expectations, and I realized that she genuinely believed what she was saying. In her mind, abandoning me during cancer surgery was just a mistake, like forgetting to pick up milk at the grocery store. "Rebecca," I said when she finally paused for breath, "if Emma needed surgery, and Greg told you to take a taxi home from the hospital because he had a work party to attend, how would you feel?" "That's different," she said immediately. "How is it different? Emma is a child. She needs her mother. And I'm not. I don't need my daughter." There was a long pause. "You're an adult, Mom. You can take care of yourself." "With cancer? After surgery? On Christmas Eve?" Another pause, shorter this time. "Look, I don't want to keep having this same argument. What do you want from us? What would it take for you to change your mind about the will?" I thought about her question seriously. What would it take? What could my children do now that would restore my faith in them? That would convince me they understood the magnitude of what they'd done, and were genuinely committed to being different. "I want you to understand why what you did was wrong," I said finally. "We do understand. We've told you we're sorry." "No, you've told me you're sorry. I'm upset. You've told me you're sorry. There was a misunderstanding. You've told me you're sorry. Things worked out the way they did. But you've never acknowledged that what you did was wrong, regardless of how I reacted to it." "What do you mean?" "I mean that even if I had been fine with spending Christmas alone in the hospital, even if I had been happy to take a taxi home from surgery, even if I had never said a word about any of it, what you did would still have been wrong. Because that's not how you treat someone you love." Rebecca was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I think you're asking too much of us, Mom. We're not perfect. We're doing the best we can with our own lives and families. We can't drop everything every time you need something." "I didn't ask you to drop everything every time," I said. "I asked you to be there once, when I had cancer surgery on Christmas Eve, and you couldn't even do that. We had commitments, to other people. Not to me. That's not fair. Life isn't fair, Rebecca. But family is supposed to be different. Family is supposed to be the people you can count on when everything else falls apart. And we're still your family, no matter what legal documents you sign." "No," I said quietly. You're my children, but you're not my family anymore. I hung up the phone and sat in my kitchen for a long time, thinking about the distinction I'd just made. Rebecca was right, that we would always be connected by blood and history. She would always be my daughter, and I would always be her mother. But family was about more than biology. Family was about choice and commitment, and showing up for each other when it mattered. My children had chosen not to show up. They had chosen their own comfort over my need. They had chosen to treat me like an obligation rather than a priority. In doing so, they had severed the bonds that made us a family, leaving only the biological connections that couldn't be broken. The next morning, I called James Whitmore and asked him to meet me for lunch. We met at a quiet restaurant downtown, and I told him about my recent conversations with my children. They still don't understand what they did wrong, I said. They keep treating it like a misunderstanding or a scheduling conflict. James nodded grimly. In my experience, people who don't understand why their actions were hurtful rarely change their behavior. They might modify it temporarily to achieve a specific goal, but the underlying selfishness remains. That's what I'm afraid of, I admit. That they'll pretend to change just long enough to get me to revise the will, and then go back to treating me like an afterthought. The estate plan we've created protects you from that possibility, James reminded me. Even if you wanted to change your mind tomorrow, the trust structure ensures that your care needs will be met regardless of your children's behavior. That was true, but it didn't address the deeper issue. I wasn't just protecting my money, I was trying to protect my heart from further damage. Each conversation with my children left me feeling more convinced that the people I'd raised and loved had become strangers to me, people whose values and priorities were so different from my own that we could barely communicate. James, I said, I want to add something to my estate plan. What kind of addition? I want to create something for my grandchildren that will help them understand what happened and why. Not just the legal explanation in the letter of instruction, but something more personal, something that will help them make better choices when they're adults. James pulled out his ever-present legal pad. What did you have in mind? I want to write letters to each of them, to be given to them when they turn 18. Not just about the inheritance, but about family and loyalty and the importance of taking care of the people you love. I want them to know what their parents did, but more importantly, I want them to know what they should do differently. That's a beautiful idea, James said, and legally we can absolutely set that up as part of the trust documentation. We spent the next hour discussing the details of how to structure this addition to my estate plan. The letters would be held by the trust administrator and delivered to each grandchild on their 18th birthday, along with an explanation of their inheritance and the circumstances that had led to its creation. As I drove home from lunch, I felt a sense of purpose I hadn't experienced in weeks. I couldn't change my children or repair our relationship, but I could try to influence the next generation. I could try to ensure that the values I'd failed to instill in my own children would have a chance to take root in my grandchildren. That afternoon, I began writing the first letter to Michael's oldest son, Jake. He was 15 now, a serious boy who loved science and astronomy, and had always been curious about how things worked. I wanted him to understand how families worked, or were supposed to work, in ways his father apparently didn't. Dear Jake, I began, by the time you read this, you'll be 18 years old and probably wondering why your grandmother left you money, instead of leaving it to your parents. The answer is complicated, but it's important, and I hope you'll take the time to understand it. I wrote about love and responsibility, about the difference between obligation and choice, about the importance of showing up for people when they need you most. I wrote about my own mistakes as a parent, the ways I might have enabled my children's selfishness by always putting their needs first. I wrote about the importance of balance in relationships, of making sure that love flows in both directions. Most importantly, I wrote about Christmas Eve and what had happened at the hospital, not to turn him against his parents, but to help him understand that actions have consequences, that treating people poorly will eventually cost you their trust and love. The letter ended up being 6 pages long, and when I finished it, I felt emotionally drained, but also satisfied. I'd said things to Jake that I could never say to his father,
things about family and loyalty that Michael had proven incapable of understanding. Over the next several days, I wrote similar letters to Emma and Tyler, tailoring each one to their personalities and the relationships I'd had with them. Emma was artistic and sensitive, so I wrote to her about the importance of caring for vulnerable people and using her empathy as a strength. Tyler was athletic and competitive, so I wrote to him about teamwork and loyalty, and the ways that winning isn't always about coming first. Each letter was different, but they all contained the same core message, that family relationships require effort and commitment from everyone involved, and that taking people for granted will eventually leave you alone. As I was finishing Tyler's letter, my phone rang. It was Michael, and his tone was different from our previous conversations, less argumentative, more resigned. "Mom, I've been thinking about what you said, about us not understanding what we did wrong, and I think maybe you're right. I think maybe we've been so focused on defending ourselves that we haven't really thought about how you experienced what happened." This was the closest thing to an acknowledgement I'd heard from any of my children, and I felt a small spark of hope. "Tell me what you think happened," I said. Michael was quiet for a moment. "I think we left you alone when you were scared and hurting. I think we prioritized things that didn't really matter over being there for you when you needed us, and I think we've been trying to justify it, instead of just admitting that we screwed up." The words were right, but something in his tone made me cautious. "What made you realize this?" "Patricia and I have been talking about it, about how we would feel if someone did that to one of our kids. And, well, we wouldn't be okay with it." "No, you would." "So I guess what I'm saying is that we're sorry, really sorry, not sorry that you're upset, but sorry for what we did." I wanted to feel relieved, but instead I felt wary. This apology was coming weeks after the fact, only after Michael had time to think about the financial implications of my decision. Was he genuinely sorry, or was he strategically sorry? "I appreciate you saying that," I said carefully. "So what happens next? Can we work on rebuilding our relationship?" And there it was. The assumption that an apology was enough, that acknowledging wrongdoing automatically led to forgiveness and restoration. Michael still didn't understand that some damage couldn't be undone with words. "Michael," I said gently, "I'm glad you understand what you did wrong, but understanding and apologizing doesn't erase what happened, or change who you revealed yourself to be when I needed you most." "What do you mean?" "I mean that for the rest of my life, whenever I need medical care or face a health crisis, I'm going to remember Christmas Eve. I'm going to remember that when I was at my most vulnerable, my children chose to be somewhere else. I'm going to remember that I had to hire strangers to take care of me because my own family wasn't available. But we're available now," Michael said. "We want to do better." "You want to do better because there are financial consequences for not doing better." "What happens the next time I need you, and there aren't any consequences? What happens when you have to choose between my needs and your convenience again?" Michael didn't have an answer for that, and his silence told me everything I needed to know. He was apologizing because he wanted his inheritance back, not because he'd experienced a genuine change of heart about family responsibility. "The will stands," I said, "but I hope you'll remember this conversation when your own children are adults. I hope you'll be there for them in ways you weren't there for me." "Mom, please, can't we find some way to fix this?" "You can fix it by being a better father to Jake and Connor than you were a son to me. You can fix it by teaching them that family means showing up when it's hard, not just when it's convenient. You can fix it by making sure they never have to doubt whether you'll be there when they need you." "What about us? What about our relationship?" I thought about that question for a long time before answering. "I don't know, Michael. I honestly don't know if we can have a relationship after this. I don't know if I can trust you again or if I even want to try." The conversation ended awkwardly, with Michael promising to think about what I'd said, and me feeling more convinced than ever that I'd made the right decision. His apology had been too little and too late, motivated by self-interest rather than genuine remorse. That evening, I called Ellen and told her about the conversation. "Do you think he means it?" she asked. "I think he means that he wants his inheritance back," I said. "I think he's figured out that the old tactics aren't working, so he's trying a new approach." "That's probably smart on your part, not to trust it. It makes me sad though, Part of me wanted him to be genuine. Part of me wanted to believe that he'd learned something from all this. Maybe he has learned something, Ellen said. Maybe not enough to repair your relationship, but maybe enough to be better for his own kids. That was what I was hoping for, what I'd written about in the letters to my grandchildren. Maybe my children were too set in their ways to change, too selfish to understand what they'd lost. But maybe the next generation could learn from their parents' mistakes. The following week, David called, and his conversation followed a similar pattern to Michael's. He apologized for abandoning me, acknowledged that he'd prioritized the wrong things, and asked for a chance to make amends. But like Michael, his apology felt calculated rather than heartfelt, and when I explained that understanding didn't automatically lead to forgiveness, he became defensive. "You're not even giving us a chance," he complained. "You've decided we're terrible people based on one incident, and nothing we do or say is going to change your mind." It wasn't one incident, David. It was a revelation. It showed me who you really are when things get difficult. People make mistakes, Mom. Even good people make mistakes. Good people make mistakes, and then learn from them, I agreed. Good people feel genuine remorse and work to rebuild trust. Good people don't immediately ask what they can do to get their inheritance back. That's not what I'm doing, isn't? David couldn't answer that, and we ended the conversation with the same stalemate I'd reached with Michael. He wanted forgiveness without consequences, restoration without real change, and I couldn't give him that. Rebecca never called to apologize. After our conversation about therapy and overreaction, she seemed to have decided that I was the problem and she was the victim. Through Michael, I heard that she was telling people I'd become unstable after my surgery, that the trauma of cancer had made me paranoid and vindictive. The irony of her response wasn't lost on me. Even faced with the complete destruction of our relationship, Rebecca couldn't acknowledge any fault on her part. In her mind, she was still the wronged party, the innocent victim of her mother's unreasonable expectation. As February turned into March, the phone calls from my children became less frequent and more formal. They would check in on my health, share basic updates about their lives, and maintain a surface-level politeness that felt like we were acquaintances rather than family. The passionate arguments and desperate pleas for forgiveness had been replaced by a cold civility that somehow felt worse. It was during this period of emotional winter that I began to understand the true cost of what I'd done. I hadn't just protected my assets and my future care, I'd also lost the relationships that had defined my identity for 30 years. I was no longer a mother in any meaningful sense, just a woman who had given birth to 3 people who now felt like strangers. The realization was both heartbreaking and liberating. Heartbreaking because I grieved for the family I'd thought I had, for the children I'd thought I'd raised, for the future I'd imagined, where my kids would take care of me the way I'd taken care of them. Liberating because I no longer had to pretend that those relationships were healthy or sustainable or worth preserving at any cost. One afternoon in late March, I was sitting in my backyard enjoying the first warm day of spring, when Emma appeared at my back gate. She was 12 years old, tall for her age, with Rebecca's dark hair and her grandfather Robert's thoughtful eyes. I hadn't seen her since before Christmas, and my heart jumped at the sight of her. "Grandma?" she called softly. "Emma, sweetheart, come." I stood up and opened the gate, pulling her into a hug that she returned enthusiastically. "Mom doesn't know I'm here," she said quietly. "I rode my bike over after school." "How are you, honey? I've missed you so much." Emma sat down in the chair next to mine and looked at me seriously. "I know something's wrong with our family. Mom and Dad whisper about you when they think I can't hear them. They say you're sick and not thinking clearly." My heart sank. "What do you think?" "I think you seem fine. You look good. Are you still recovering from your surgery?" "I'm much better now, thank you." Emma nodded and was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Grandma, why didn't anyone go to the hospital with you?" The question hit me like a physical blow. Of course Emma would have noticed. Children always notice more than adults think they do. "What did your mom tell you about that?" she said. "You told them not to come, that you wanted to be alone, but that doesn't sound like you." "Smart girl. Too smart for her own good. Maybe." "Emma, sweetheart, Sometimes adults make choices that are hard to understand. Sometimes people do things that hurt other people even when they don't mean to. Did mom hurt you? I looked at this child, this innocent girl who was caught in the middle of an adult conflict she hadn't created and couldn't fix, and I tried to figure out how to be honest without being damaging. Yes, I said finally, but that doesn't mean she doesn't love you, or that you're responsible for fixing anything between us. Emma nodded solemnly. Are you going to be okay? I'm going to be fine, I said, and I realized as I said it, that it was true. I have good doctors and good friends, and I'm taking good care of myself. I love you, Grandma. I love you too, sweetheart. More than you know. We spent an hour together in my backyard, talking about school and her friends, and her art project. She showed me drawings she'd made, and I told her stories about when her mother was her age. For that hour I felt like a grandmother again, connected to the next generation in ways that transcended the conflict with my children. When it was time for Emma to go home, I walked her to the gate and hugged her goodbye. Can I come visit you again? She asked. Anytime you want, I said, but you should probably tell your mom where you're going. I don't want her to worry about you. Emma nodded and rode away on her bike, leaving me standing in my backyard with tears on my cheeks. She was going to be okay, I realized. Whatever happened between me and Rebecca, Emma was going to grow up to be a strong, thoughtful, caring person. And maybe, when she was 18 and read the letter I'd written for her, she would understand why her grandmother had made the choices she'd made. That evening, Rebecca called, furious. Emma told me she came to see you today. I don't want her over there anymore. Why not? Because you're filling her head with lies about our family. You're trying to turn her against us.
I didn't say a single negative thing about you, or Greg, I said truthfully. You didn't have to. Just the fact that you're seeing her behind my back sends a message. What message is that? That we can't be trusted. That we're the bad guys in whatever drama you've created in your head. I thought about pointing out that Rebecca was proving my point by forbidding her daughter to see her grandmother. But I knew it would only escalate the conflict. I won't see Emma if you don't want me to, I said quietly. Good. And I don't want you contacting her in any way. No phone calls, no letters, no showing up at her school. She's my daughter, and I decide who she spends time with. Rebecca hung up before I could respond, leaving me sitting in my kitchen and grieving for another loss. First my children, now my grandchildren. The isolation was becoming complete, but as I sat there in the quiet of my house, I realized something important. Rebecca could control whether I saw Emma now, but she couldn't control what happened when Emma turned 18. She couldn't prevent Emma from reading the letter I'd written for her, couldn't stop her from inheriting the trust fund I'd established for her, couldn't keep her from making her own choices about our relationship. Rebecca was trying to control the narrative now, but eventually Emma would be old enough to hear all sides of the story and make her own decisions. And when that time came, I wanted Emma to know that her grandmother had loved her enough to protect her future, even when it cost her their relationship in the present. I went to my desk and pulled out the letter I'd written for Emma, adding a postscript about this conversation and my hope that someday we would be able to rebuild our relationship on her terms rather than her parents' terms. Then I sealed the letter and put it with the others, trusting that time and truth would eventually bring my grandchildren back to me, even if my children were lost forever. 6 months after Rebecca banned Emma from visiting me, I received an unexpected phone call from my grandson Jake. It was a Thursday evening in September, and I was reading in my living room when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. Grandma Sharon? It's Jake. I sat up straighter, surprised to hear from Michael's older son. Jake, honey, how are you? How did you get this number? I got it from the phone book. Listen, I can't talk long because Dad doesn't know I'm calling, but I wanted to ask you something. My heart clenched at the secretiveness in his voice. Another grandchild being forced to sneak around to maintain contact with me. What is it, sweetheart? I'm working on a project for school about family history, and I wanted to interview you about Grandpa Robert and what life was like when Dad was growing up. Could we maybe meet somewhere? Like at the library or something? I was touched that he wanted to include me in his project, but I was also concerned about the implications. Does your father know about this project? He knows about the project, but he doesn't know I want to talk to you specifically. He's been weird about you lately. Him and Mom both, they act like you're sick or something, but you sounded fine when I talked to you last time. When did we talk last time, Jake? At Christmas, before your surgery. You seemed totally normal then. Of course, Jake would remember our conversation from Christmas Day, before everything fell apart. He would have no context for understanding why his father was now treating me like a pariah. Jake, I would love to help with your project, but I think you should talk to your dad first. I don't want to cause problems between you and your parents. Everything's already a problem, Graham. Nobody talks about anything real anymore. Dad just says you're going through a rough time and we need to give you space, but that doesn't make any sense. If you're going through a rough time, wouldn't you want your family around you? The wisdom of this 15-year-old boy was both heartbreaking and encouraging. He understood, instinctively, what his father had failed to grasp, that families are supposed to come together during difficult times, not drift apart. You're very smart, Jake, I said carefully, but sometimes adult relationships are complicated in ways that are hard to explain. Are you mad at Dad? I paused, trying to figure out how to answer that question honestly without putting Jake in an impossible position. I'm disappointed in some choices your dad made, I said finally. But that doesn't change how much I love you and your brother. What kind of choices? That's something you'd need to discuss with him, honey. It's not my place to explain your father's actions. Jake was quiet for a moment. Grandma, are you dying? Is that why everyone's acting so weird? No, sweetheart. I'm not dying. I'm healthier now than I've been in months. Then why can't we see you? The pain in his voice was evident, and I felt a surge of anger at Michael for putting his son in this position. Jake was clearly confused and hurt by the sudden absence of his grandmother from his life, and Michael was handling it by pretending I was somehow unstable rather than explaining the real reasons for our estrangement. Jake, I want you to know that I love you and Connor very much, and that hasn't changed. The problems I'm having are with the adults in your family, not with you kids. So we could still see you if Dad said it was okay? Yes. Absolutely. I'm going to talk to him, Jake said with determination. This is stupid. Families are supposed to stick together. After we hung up, I sat in my living room feeling a mixture of pride and worry. Pride because Jake was clearly growing into a young man with strong values and the courage to question adults when they weren't making sense. Worry because I knew Michael wouldn't appreciate being challenged by his teenager, and Jake might end up bearing the brunt of his father's frustration. True to his word, Jake did talk to his father. 2 days later, Michael called me, and his voice was tight with anger. Mom, Jake tells me he called you about some school project. He did. I told him he should discuss it with you first. He also says you told him that our problems are with the adults, not the kids. What exactly did you mean by that? I took a deep breath. I meant that Jake and Connor haven't done anything wrong, and they shouldn't be punished for the conflict between us. They're not being punished. We're protecting them. From what? From being caught in the middle of an adult situation they can't understand. Michael, they're already caught in the middle. Jake called me because he's confused about why his grandmother has suddenly disappeared from his life. Connor's probably wondering the same thing. By refusing to explain what's happening, you're making it worse for them, not better. What would you have me tell them? That their grandmother has cut them out of her will because she's angry about a misunderstanding. I would have you tell them the truth, that their father and aunts made choices that hurt me deeply, and that we're still working through the consequences of those choices. That would turn them against us, only if you think what you did was wrong. Michael was quiet for a long moment. Jake wants to come see you. I would love to see him. I'm not comfortable with that right now. Why not? Because I don't trust you not to poison him against us. The accusation stung, partly because it was so unfair and partly because it revealed how little Michael really knew me. In 33 years of being his mother, had I ever used him as a weapon against his father? Had I ever tried to turn him against anyone? Had I ever been anything but supportive of his relationships and choices? Michael, when have I ever done anything like that? This whole situation is unprecedented, Mom. I don't know what you're capable of anymore. I'm capable of loving my grandchildren and wanting what's best for them. I'm capable of answering their questions honestly if they ask them. But I'm not capable of using children as pawns in an adult conflict. Jake is 15. He's not a child anymore. Then maybe he's old enough to hear the truth about what happened at Christmas. There's nothing to hear. We've been over this 1,000 times. Because every time we talk about it, you minimize what you did and act like I'm overreacting. You've never once acknowledged that leaving your mother alone in a hospital on Christmas Eve was wrong, regardless of how I felt about it. We had obligations to other people, not to me. Mom, I can't keep having this same conversation. It's not productive. Then stop minimizing what you did and start taking responsibility for it. Michael hung up without saying goodbye, and I knew that Jake's request to see me had been denied. I felt sorry for Jake, who was being kept from his grandmother because his father couldn't face the truth about his own behavior. That evening, I decided to write Jake a letter. Not one of the letters that would be held in trust until he turned 18, but a regular letter that I could mail to him directly. I knew Michael might intercept it, but I hoped that Jake would at least have a chance to read it first. I wrote about how much I loved him and Connor, how proud I was of the young man he was becoming, and how sorry I was that adult conflicts were affecting his relationships with people he cared about. I didn't explain the details of what had happened at Christmas, but I did encourage him to ask questions and seek truth, even when it was uncomfortable. I also wrote about the importance of treating people with kindness and respect, especially family members, and about how actions have consequences that sometimes last longer than we expect. I hoped he would understand that I was trying to teach him something important about relationships and responsibility, even if I couldn't be more explicit about the circumstances. I mailed the letter the next day, and never heard back from Jake. I didn't know if he'd received it or if Michael had intercepted it, but I hoped that someday when Jake was older and had more context for understanding our family's dynamics, he might remember his grandmother's words about truth and integrity. As autumn progressed, I found myself settling into a new routine that didn't include my children or grandchildren. Maria had gradually reduced her hours as I became more independent, coming only twice a week to help with heavy cleaning and medical appointments. The rest of the time, I was on my own, and I was surprised to discover how much I enjoyed my solitude. I had joined a senior center that offered classes and social activities, and I'd made several new friends there. There was Dorothy, a retired teacher who shared my love of reading and had introduced me to her book club. There was Frank, a widower who had lost his wife the previous year, and understood something about rebuilding your life after loss. There was Susan, a former nurse who had been through her own health scares and was generous with practical advice about recovery and self-care. These new relationships were different from my family relationships in fundamental ways. They were based on mutual interest and respect rather than obligation. They involved give and take rather than one-sided sacrifice. They made me feel valued for who I was rather than what I could provide. I also began volunteering at the local animal shelter, something I'd always wanted to do but never had time for when I was constantly managing family crises. Working with abandoned and neglected animals was therapeutic in ways I hadn't expected. These creatures had been let down by the humans who were supposed to care for them, just as I had been let down by my children. But they were resilient and capable of forming new bonds with people who treated them well. There was an old dog named Rusty who had been brought to the shelter after his elderly owner died, and the family decided they didn't want the burden of caring for him. Rusty was arthritic and moved slowly, and most potential adopters passed him by in favor of younger, more energetic dogs. But I saw something in his eyes that reminded me of my own situation, the wariness of someone who had been abandoned by people he trusted. I started spending extra time with Rusty during my volunteer shifts, taking him for gentle walks and sitting with him in the shelter's garden area. He was initially suspicious of affection, but gradually he began to trust me, eventually resting his head on my lap while I read to him from whatever book I'd brought that day. After 2 months of this routine, I realized I wanted to adopt Rusty myself. I'd been living alone since Robert died 8 years earlier, and I'd forgotten how comforting it could be to have another living being in the house. The shelter staff was thrilled to place Rusty with someone they knew would take good care of him, and I brought him home on a crisp October afternoon. Rusty settled into my house as if he'd always belonged there. He claimed Robert's old chair as his own, which felt oddly appropriate since Robert had always wanted a dog but I'd been too busy with the children to consider getting one. Rusty was quiet and undemanding, content to sleep in patches of sunlight and follow me from room to room as I went about my daily activities. Having Rusty in the house changed something fundamental about my living situation. I was no longer alone. I was choosing solitude. There's a significant difference between those two states. Being alone had felt like abandonment, like something that had been done to me. Choosing solitude felt like empowerment, like a decision I was making for my own well-being. One evening in November, I was sitting in my living room with Rusty at my feet when my phone rang. It was Emma, calling from what sounded like a noisy restaurant. "Grandma, it's me," she whispered. "I can't talk long, but I wanted you to know that I'm thinking about you." My heart swelled with love and concern. "Emma, sweetheart, where are you?" "We're at dinner for Mom's birthday." I told them I was going to the bathroom, but I really wanted to call you. "How are you, honey?" "I'm okay. School's good. I made the honor roll, and I'm taking an art class that I really like." "I'm so proud of you. Grandma, I miss you. I don't understand why Mom won't let me see you." I closed my eyes, feeling the familiar pain of this impossible situation. "I miss you too, more than you know." "Are you really sick like Mom says?" "No, sweetheart, I'm healthy and happy. I even got a dog. His name is Rusty." "Really? What kind of dog?" "He's a mixed breed, kind of looks like a golden retriever but smaller. He's older and very gentle. I wish I could meet him." "Maybe someday you will." "Grandma, I have to go. Mom's looking for me, but I wanted you to know that I love you, and I don't believe what she says about you being unstable or anything like that." "I love you too, Em. Take care of yourself and remember that no matter what happens, you're a smart, strong girl and you can trust your own judgment about people." "I will. Bye, Grandma." After she hung up, I sat in my chair petting Rusty and thinking about Emma's call. She was 14 now, old enough to see through her mother's attempts to control the narrative about our family conflict. She was forming her own opinions about the situation based on her own experiences with me, and those opinions seemed to contradict what Rebecca was telling her. That gave me hope. If Emma could see through Rebecca's manipulation now, then Jake and Connor and Tyler probably could too. My grandchildren were smart kids who had been raised with good values. Even if their parents had lost sight of those values themselves, they would eventually be able to distinguish between truth and propaganda, between love and control. The holidays approached with a strange sense of detachment. The previous year, I'd been deep in chemotherapy and barely aware of Christmas, until it was over. This year I was healthy and aware but completely cut off from my family's celebrations. For the first time in 33 years, I wouldn't be hosting Christmas dinner or shopping for presents for my children and grandchildren. Initially, the prospect had felt devastating. Christmas had always been my favorite holiday, the time when our family came together and remembered what we meant to each other. But as December arrived, I found myself feeling less sad about missing Christmas, and more curious about what it would be like to celebrate on my own terms. Dorothy from the book club invited me to spend Christmas with her daughter's family, and Frank suggested we go to the senior center's Christmas party. Both offers were kind, but I realized I wanted to do something different. I wanted to create a new kind of Christmas celebration that reflected who I was becoming rather than who I had been. I decided to volunteer at the homeless shelter on Christmas Day, serving meals to people who had nowhere else to go. It seemed fitting somehow. I was also displaced from my usual celebrations, and there was something appealing about spending the holiday with other people who were making the best of difficult circumstances. I also planned a quiet Christmas Eve at home with Rusty, during which I would write in a journal I'd started keeping since my surgery. I wanted to document this period of transformation in my life, not just for my own processing but as a record for my grandchildren to read someday. I wanted them to understand how their grandmother had rebuilt her life after it fell apart, how she had found new sources of meaning and connection after losing the relationships she'd thought would sustain her forever. On December 22nd, exactly 1 year after my surgery, I received an unexpected visitor. I was in my kitchen making lunch when I heard a car door slam in my driveway, followed by footsteps on my front porch. When I opened the door, I found Tyler standing there, looking uncertain and nervous. Tyler was David's son, 17 years old, and a senior in high school. He was tall and athletic,
with his father's dark hair and serious expression. I hadn't seen him since the previous Christmas, before everything fell apart, and I was shocked by how much he'd grown in just 1 year. "Tyler, honey, what are you doing here?" "Hi, Grandma. I know Dad doesn't want me coming here, but I needed to talk to you." I stepped aside to let him in, my heart racing with concern and joy. "Of course, come in. Are you all right?" "Yeah, I'm fine. I've been thinking about stuff, and I have some questions." We sat in my living room, and Tyler seemed to be gathering his courage for whatever he wanted to say. Rusty wandered over and sniffed his shoes, and Tyler reached down to pet him. "You really got a dog," he said with a small smile. "I really did. His name is Rusty. He's good company." "That's cool. I always wanted a dog, but Mom's allergic." We made small talk for a few minutes about school and basketball, and his plans for college, but I could tell he had something more serious on his mind. "Tyler, what did you want to ask me about?" He took a deep breath. "Grandma, what really happened last Christmas, with your surgery and everything?" I studied his face carefully. "What has your father told you?" "That you were upset about some misunderstanding, and you overreacted by changing your will. He says you're going through a difficult time because of the cancer, and we need to give you space to work through your feelings." "What do you think about that explanation?" Tyler frowned. "It doesn't make sense. You're not the type of person to overreact to things. And if you were having a hard time, wouldn't you want your family around you instead of pushing them away?" Once again, I was struck by the wisdom of my grandchildren. They understood instinctively what my children seemed incapable of grasping. "You're right that it doesn't make sense," I said carefully. "Tyler, I'm going to tell you what really happened, but I need you to understand that this might be difficult to hear. I can handle it." I believed Tyler had always been mature for his age, and he was approaching adulthood. He deserved to know the truth about his family. I told him everything: the surgery on Christmas Eve, the abandonment at the hospital, the taxi conversation, the Christmas Day alone, all of it. I didn't editorialize or express anger. I just stated the facts as clearly as I could, and let him draw his own conclusions. When I finished, Tyler was quiet for a long time. He was staring at Rusty, who had fallen asleep with his head on Tyler's foot. "Dad wasn't at the hospital at all?" he asked finally. "None of them were. And Aunt Rebecca really asked you to take a taxi home?" "She did." Tyler shook his head. "That's really messed up, Grandma." "Yes, it is. And then they act like you're the one with the problem. They're having trouble accepting responsibility for what they did." Tyler was quiet again, processing what I'd told him. "So you changed your will because you realized you couldn't count on them to take care of you." "That's part of it, but it's also about making sure you kids are taken care of. The money I'm leaving you will be there for your education and your future, regardless of what your parents do with their own finances." "Jake told me you left us money for college." "Jake talked to you about that?" "We all talk about it. Me and Jake and Emma. We know something's weird about our family situation, and we try to figure it out together." I was both touched and concerned that my grandchildren were supporting each other through this difficult situation. It spoke well of the bonds between them, but it also meant they were all being affected by their parents' choices. "What do you think about what I've done?" I asked. Tyler considered the question seriously. "I think Dad and my aunts acted really selfish, and you had to protect yourself. I wish it hadn't come to that, but I don't blame you, even though it means your parents won't inherit anything." "Grandma, they're all doing fine financially. Dad's got a good job, Uncle Michael makes good money, and Aunt Rebecca's family is comfortable. They'll be okay without an inheritance, but you might not be okay if you get sick again and need expensive care." The maturity of his reasoning impressed me. Tyler understood the practical implications of my decision in ways his father apparently did. "Tyler, I want you to know that I love your father very much, even though I'm disappointed in him, and I hope that someday we'll be able to repair our relationship. But regardless of what happens between us, I want you to remember this conversation. I want you to remember that families are supposed to take care of each other, especially during difficult times." "I will remember, and I want you to know that you can always come to me if you need anything, even if your parents don't approve. You're my grandson, and that relationship exists independently of whatever problems I have with your father." Tyler nodded solemnly. "Grandma, can I ask you something else?" "Of course. Are you happy, like with your life now?" The question surprised me, but I realized I knew the answer immediately. Yes, I said. I'm happy. I'm healthier than I've been in years. I have good friends. I'm doing work that I find meaningful. And I have Rusty here to keep me company. I'm not happy about losing my relationships with your parents, but I'm happy with the life I've built for myself. Tyler smiled. The first genuine smile I'd seen from him since he arrived. That's good. Dad always talks about you like you're miserable and lonely, but you seem pretty content to me. I am content, more content than I was when I was constantly worrying about everyone else's problems and neglecting my own needs. We talked for another hour about college applications and his basketball season, and his girlfriend. It felt wonderfully normal, like the relationship between a grandmother and grandson should feel. When it was time for Tyler to leave, he hugged me tightly and promised to visit again soon. I'll probably have to sneak around to do it, he said, but I don't care. You're my grandma, and I'm not going to let their weirdness ruin our relationship. After Tyler left, I sat in my living room feeling lighter than I had in months. My grandchildren were going to be all right. They were seeing through their parents' attempts to control the narrative, and they were maintaining their own relationships with me, despite the family conflict. That evening, I called James Whitmore and asked him to add a provision to my estate plan. I wanted to ensure that if any of my grandchildren chose to maintain a relationship with me, despite their parents' disapproval, they would have access to emergency funds for things like college applications, transportation, or other needs their parents might refuse to provide out of spite. That's a wise addition, James said. It protects them from being used as pawns in this conflict. Exactly. I don't want them to suffer because of their parents' poor choices. As Christmas approached, I felt more optimistic about the future than I had since my surgery. I was building a new life based on authentic relationships and genuine mutual care. I was protecting my grandchildren's futures while teaching them important lessons about integrity and responsibility. And I was finally putting my own needs and well-being first, something I should have learned to do decades earlier. On Christmas Eve, I sat in my living room with Rusty beside me, and wrote in my journal about the year that had passed. It had been a year of loss and transformation, of ending some relationships and beginning others, of learning to distinguish between love and obligation.
I was no longer the woman who had desperately needed her children's approval and presence. I was someone who had learned to value herself independently of other people's opinions or actions. I was someone who had discovered that being alone didn't have to mean being lonely, and that family wasn't just about blood relations but about the people who actually showed up when you needed them. As I wrote, snow began to fall outside my window, and I thought about the Christmas Eve 1 year earlier, when I had lain alone in a hospital bed watching the same kind of snowfall. That woman had been broken and betrayed and lost. This woman was strong and self-sufficient, and at peace. The transformation had been painful, but it had also been necessary. Sometimes you have to lose everything you thought you wanted in order to find what you actually need. 2 years had passed since that Christmas Eve in the hospital, and I was sitting in my backyard on a warm June morning, watching Rusty chase butterflies with more enthusiasm than his arthritis should have allowed. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Grandma, it's Emma. I graduate tomorrow. I wanted you to know." My heart jumped as I read the message. Emma was 16 now, and apparently had found a way to contact me, despite Rebecca's continued efforts to keep us apart. I quickly typed back, "Congratulations, sweetheart. I'm so proud of you." Within seconds, another message appeared. "Can you come? It's at the high school auditorium at 2 p.m. I understand if you can't." I stared at the phone screen, my mind racing. Attending Emma's graduation would inevitably lead to a confrontation with Rebecca, and probably with Michael and David as well. It would be uncomfortable for everyone involved, including Emma. But missing my granddaughter's graduation because of my children's stubbornness felt like letting them win, like allowing their poor choices to rob me of important moments with my grandchildren. I typed back, "I'll be there." That evening, I called James Whitmore to give him a heads up about my plans. "Are you sure this is wise?" he asked. "Your children have made it clear they don't want contact with you." "My granddaughter invited me," I said firmly. "She's 16 years old, capable of making her own decisions about who she wants at her graduation." Rebecca could cause a scene, Let her. Emma will see how her mother behaves when faced with her own mother's presence. Sometimes the best way to teach children about character is to let them observe adults making choices. James was quiet for a moment. Sharon, you've changed a lot in the past 2 years. Yes, I have. You're stronger, more confident, less willing to accommodate other people's bad behavior. I've learned that trying to keep peace at any cost usually just enables people to treat you badly. Just be prepared for whatever happens tomorrow. If Rebecca decides to make this about her grievances instead of about Emma's achievement, it could get ugly. I understood the risks, but I also understood something else. I wasn't the same woman who had once prioritized my children's comfort over my own dignity. If Rebecca wanted to cause a scene at her daughter's graduation, that was her choice. I wasn't going to hide from important moments in my grandchildren's lives because their parents couldn't behave like adults. The next afternoon, I arrived at the high school 30 minutes early and found a seat in the back of the auditorium. I dressed carefully for the occasion, a navy blue dress that made me look confident and put together, with the pearl necklace Robert had given me for our 20th anniversary. I wanted to look like the kind of grandmother any child would be proud to claim. As families began filling the auditorium, I spotted my children arriving together. Michael and Patricia came in first, followed by David and Lisa, and finally Rebecca and Greg. They were clearly coordinating their seating, choosing a section in the middle of the auditorium, where they could spread out across an entire row. None of them noticed me in the back corner, which was exactly what I'd hoped for. I wanted to attend Emma's graduation without turning it into a family drama if possible. The ceremony began with the usual speeches from administrators and valedictorians. I found myself genuinely enjoying the celebration of these young people's achievements. Even though I didn't know most of them, there was something deeply satisfying about witnessing a milestone that represented hard work and future potential. When they called Emma's name, my heart swelled with pride. She walked across the stage with poise and confidence, accepting her diploma with a smile that could have lit up the entire auditorium. As she posed for the official photographer, she glanced toward the back of the room and caught my eye. Her smile grew even brighter, and she gave me a small wave that made my eyes fill with tears. In that moment, I knew I'd made the right choice by coming. Whatever drama might follow, Emma would always remember that her grandmother had been there for one of the most important days of her young life. After the ceremony ended, I planned to slip out quickly and avoid any confrontation, but as I was making my way toward the exit, I heard someone call my name. "Mrs. Jones." I turned to find a young woman in a graduation cap and gown standing behind me. It took me a moment to recognize Connor, Michael's younger son, who was apparently graduating from high school the same year as Emma. "Connor, honey. Congratulations," I said, pulling him into a hug that he returned enthusiastically. "Grandma, I can't believe you're here. Dad said you weren't. I mean, he said you probably wouldn't." "I wouldn't miss this for anything," I said firmly. "I'm so proud of you." Connor, where did you—" Patricia's voice trailed off as she approached us and saw me standing with her son. "Oh. Hi, Patricia," I said calmly. "Sharon, I didn't expect to see you here. Emma invited me." Patricia glanced around nervously, clearly looking for Michael. "Does Michael know you're here?" "I didn't come to see Michael," I said. "I came to see my grandchildren graduate." Before Patricia could respond, Emma appeared at my side, still glowing with excitement from the ceremony. "Grandma, you came." She threw her arms around me with such enthusiasm that several nearby families turned to look at us. "Of course I came. Sweetheart, I'm so proud of you. I can't believe you're really here. I was afraid Mom had scared you away from coming." Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Rebecca approaching with an expression that could have curdled milk. Greg was right behind her, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world. "Emma, step away from her right now," Rebecca said in a voice that was supposed to be quiet, but carried clearly to everyone within 20 feet. "Mom, it's my graduation. Grandma came to see me graduate. She wasn't invited. I invited her. You don't have the authority to invite her. I'm your mother, and I decide who comes to your events." I watched this exchange with a mixture of sadness and fascination. Rebecca was so focused on controlling the situation that she was completely oblivious to how she looked to the other families around us. She was making a scene at her daughter's graduation, over the presence of the child's grandmother. Rebecca, I said quietly, this is Emma's day. Don't turn it into something ugly. Don't tell me how to handle my daughter. Then don't handle. She's 16 years old and capable of deciding who she wants at her graduation. She's a child and you're manipulating her against her family. Her family is right here supporting her achievement. I'm part of her family too. By now, we'd attracted quite an audience. Other families were watching our drama unfold with expressions ranging from curiosity to disapproval. Michael had appeared with David and Lisa, and they were clearly trying to figure out how to diffuse the situation without making it worse. Mom, Michael said, his voice carefully controlled. Maybe we should discuss this at home. There's nothing to discuss, I said. I came to see my grandchildren graduate. I've done that. Now I'm leaving. I hugged Emma and Connor again, telling them how proud I was and how much I loved them. Then I walked toward the exit, leaving my children to deal with the aftermath of Rebecca's public tantrum. But before I reached the door, Tyler appeared at my side. He was taller than I remembered, clearly having grown over the past year, and he looked confident and self-assured in his graduation cap and gown. Grandma, wait up. Tyler, honey, congratulations. You look so handsome. Thanks. Listen, I wanted to tell you something before you leave. What is it? I got into state university. Full scholarship for basketball, and I wanted you to know that your letter helped me with my application essay. My letter, the one you sent me last year, about family and responsibility and making good choices. I wrote my essay about learning to think for myself and not just accepting what adults tell me without questioning it. The admissions counselor said it was one of the most mature essays they'd read from someone my age. I felt tears threatening again. Tyler, that's wonderful. I'm so proud of you. I wanted to thank you for teaching me to ask questions and think for myself, even when it's uncomfortable. That's one of the most important skills you can develop, I know. And Grandma, I'm going to keep visiting you. No matter what Dad's, I'm almost 18, and I can make my own decisions about who I want in my life. After I left the high school that day, I drove home feeling energized rather than drained. Yes, Rebecca had tried to cause a scene, but she'd only succeeded in making herself look petty and controlling. My grandchildren had seen the contrast between their grandmother's calm dignity and their mother's public tantrum, and they'd drawn their own conclusions about who was behaving appropriately. More importantly, I'd learned that my grandchildren were growing into strong, independent young people who weren't going to let their parents' conflicts dictate their relationships. Tyler was going to college on a full scholarship and planned to maintain contact with me. Connor had clearly been happy to see me, and wasn't intimidated by his parents' disapproval, and Emma had been brave enough to invite me to her graduation, despite knowing it would anger her mother. That evening, Emma called me from her cell phone. Grandma, I'm sorry about Mom today. She was so embarrassing. Don't apologize for your mother's behavior, sweetheart. You can't control what other people do. I just wanted you to know that I'm really glad you came. It meant everything to me to see you there. It meant everything to me to be there. Grandma, I've been thinking about some things, and I want to ask you about them. What kind of things? About what really happened between you and my parents. I'm old enough to hear the truth now. I took a deep breath. Emma was 16, mature for her age, and clearly capable of handling difficult information. She deserved to know the truth about her family, so I told her everything. The surgery, the abandonment, the Christmas alone in the hospital, all of. Emma listened without interrupting, occasionally making soft sounds of shock or dismay. When I finished, there was a long silence. Grandma, Emma said finally, that's horrible. I can't believe they left you alone in the hospital on Christmas. It was a difficult time, and then they act like you're the one who's being unreasonable. That's so manipulative. People sometimes have trouble accepting responsibility for their actions. Mom always talks about how family is supposed to forgive and forget, but she never talks about how family is supposed to show up for each other in the first place. The wisdom of this 16-year-old girl took my breath away. She understood something about relationships that her mother apparently never would. Emma, I want you to remember something important. Family relationships require effort from everyone involved. Love isn't just a feeling, it's a choice you make every day to treat people with kindness and respect. Don't let anyone convince you that you owe people loyalty who don't show you the same loyalty in return. I won't. And Grandma, I'm going to keep calling you and visiting you, no matter what Mom says. I'm old enough to decide who I want in my life. Over the following months, I began to see my grandchildren regularly again, but on their terms rather than their parents' terms. Tyler kept his promise and visited me every few weeks, usually bringing homework to work on, at my kitchen table, while we talked about his college plans and his girlfriend and his dreams for the future. Emma called me several times a week and started coming over on Saturday afternoons to help me in my garden. Connor was more cautious about defying his parents directly, but he found ways to stay in touch through text messages and occasional phone calls. My children, meanwhile, seemed to be struggling with this new reality. They couldn't control their children's relationships with me anymore, and they couldn't continue to paint me as unstable or manipulative when their own kids were actively choosing to spend time with me. Michael called me in late summer with what sounded like a prepared speech. "Mom, the kids have been talking about you a lot lately, and Patricia and I think it might be time to try to work things out between us." "What kind of working things out did you have in mind?" "Maybe we could have a family dinner, talk through our differences, try to find a way to move forward." "Michael, we've had this conversation before. Nothing has changed, but the kids miss their grandmother. They want us all to be a family again. The kids are maintaining their own relationships with me. If you want to be part of that, you're welcome to join us. But I'm not interested in pretending that what happened at Christmas didn't matter." "Mom, how long are you going to hold this grudge?" "It's not a grudge, Mike. It's a boundary. There's a difference. What would it take for you to forgive us?" I thought about that question seriously. What would it take? It would take you understanding that what you did was wrong, not just unfortunate or poorly timed, but wrong. It would take you acknowledging that you hurt me deeply, and that you've never taken responsibility for that hurt. It would take you proving that you're capable of putting my needs first when it really matters, not just when it's convenient for you. That's a pretty high bar. Is it really too much to ask that you treat your mother with the same consideration you'd give to a friend or coworker? Michael didn't have an answer for that. As autumn arrived, I received an unexpected phone call from David. His voice was quiet and subdued, very different from his usual tone. "Mom, I need to tell you something." "What is it?" "Lisa and I are getting divorced." I felt a pang of sympathy despite everything that had happened between us. "I'm sorry to hear that, David. Are you all right?" "Not really. It's been a long time coming, but it's still hard. Tyler's taking it pretty well, but it's still a big change for him. How can I help?" "I was wondering, would it be okay if I came to see you sometime? I know things have been weird between us, but I could really use someone to talk to." "Of course you can come see me. You're always welcome here." David came over the following Saturday afternoon, and he looked older and more tired than I'd seen him in years. We sat in my living room with Rusty between us, and David told me about the breakdown of his marriage, his regrets about choices he'd made, and his fears about being a good father to Tyler during such a difficult time. As he talked, I realized something had shifted in him. The defensive, justifying David I'd spoken to over the past 2 years was gone, replaced by someone who seemed genuinely vulnerable and open to difficult conversations. "Mom," he said eventually, "I owe you an apology." "For what?" "For Christmas, for leaving you alone in the hospital, for prioritizing my own comfort over your needs, for everything." I studied his face carefully. This didn't feel like the calculated apologies Michael and Rebecca had offered. This felt genuine. "Thank you for saying that. I don't expect it to fix everything between us. I know I hurt you badly, and I know words aren't enough to undo that, but I wanted you to know that I understand what I did wrong, and I'm sorry." "What made you realize this?" David smiled sadly. "Going through a divorce makes you think about all your relationships differently. Lisa and I are splitting up partly because we stopped showing up for each other when things got difficult. We started taking each other for granted, and prioritizing our individual needs over our partnership." Sound familiar? It did sound familiar. "I realized that's what we did to you, Mom. We took you for granted and assumed you'd always be there no matter how we treated you. We prioritized our own convenience over your needs, and when you finally said enough,
We acted like you were being unreasonable instead of recognizing that we'd driven you away. David, I appreciate you telling me this. I want to try to rebuild our relationship, if you're willing. Not because I want anything from you, but because I love you and I miss having you in my life. It won't be easy, I know. Trust has to be rebuilt slowly, but I'm willing to do the work, if you are. For the first time in 2 years, I felt hope about the possibility of reconciling with one of my children. David's apology felt sincere because it came without conditions or expectations. He wasn't asking me to change my will or forget what had happened. He was simply acknowledging his mistakes and asking for a chance to do better. Yes, I said, I'm willing to try. Over the following months, David proved that his apology had been genuine. He called regularly just to check on me, not because he needed anything but because he wanted to maintain contact. He visited every few weeks, sometimes bringing Tyler but sometimes coming alone just to spend time with me. He helped me with household projects and medical appointments, showing up consistently in small ways that gradually rebuilt my trust in him. He also did something that neither Michael nor Rebecca had done. He defended me to his siblings when they criticized my decision to change my will. She didn't destroy our family, he told them during one family gathering that Tyler later described to me. We destroyed it by abandoning her when she needed us most. She just made the destruction official. By the time Christmas arrived again, David and I had developed a new relationship that was healthier and more honest than what we'd had before. We talked openly about our expectations and boundaries. He showed up when he said he would. He prioritized my needs when I asked for help, not because he felt obligated but because he chose to. On Christmas Eve, exactly 3 years after my surgery, David and Tyler came to my house for dinner. It wasn't the big family gathering I'd once hosted, but it was warm and genuine in ways those larger celebrations had never been. We talked and laughed, and remembered Robert together, and I felt more grateful for this small, authentic celebration than I ever had for the elaborate productions I'd once organized. As we were cleaning up after dinner, Tyler said something that perfectly captured what I'd learned over the past 3 years. You know what, Grandma? I think this is better than the old family dinners. Why is that? Because everyone who's here actually wants to be here. Nobody's here out of obligation, or because they feel like they have to be. We're here because we love each other, and we choose to be together. He was right. The family I'd built through loss and conflict and careful boundary setting was smaller than the one I'd started with, but it was more genuine. The people in my life now were there because they wanted to be, not because they felt obligated or because they wanted something from me. Emma graduated from high school that spring, and chose to attend college just 2 hours away, so she could visit me regularly. Connor got accepted to his first choice university, and started calling me every Sunday to tell me about his classes and his new independence. Tyler finished his junior year with excellent grades, and a deepening relationship with the young woman he'd been dating for over a year. Michael and Rebecca never apologized or acknowledged their role in the destruction of our family relationship. They seemed to have decided that I was permanently unreasonable, and that maintaining their victimhood narrative was more important than rebuilding their relationships with me. I felt sad about that choice, but I no longer felt responsible for fixing it. On a warm evening in late May, I was sitting in my backyard with Rusty when James Whitmore called with an update on my estate planning. Sharon, I wanted to let you know that all your grandchildren will be 18 within the next 3 years. Emma turns 18 next month, Connor will be 18 in the fall, and Tyler will reach 18 the following spring. Time flies, I said. Have you given any thought to what you want to do about the letters you wrote for them? They were meant to be delivered on their 18th birthdays, but given that you're now in regular contact with all of them, I'd been thinking about that question for months. The letters I'd written during the darkest period of my estrangement from my family contained important messages about family loyalty and personal responsibility, but they also reflected the pain and anger I'd felt at the time. My grandchildren had already learned those lessons through their own experiences and choices. I think I'd like to give them the letters in person, not as legal documents, but as personal messages from their grandmother about the importance of treating people with kindness and showing up when it matters. That sounds perfect. A few weeks later, on Emma's 18th birthday, I invited her to my house for a special dinner. After we'd eaten and celebrated with cake, I handed her the letter I'd written 3 years earlier. This is something I wrote for you when I was going through a very difficult time. I want you to read it, but I also want you to know that you've already proven you understand everything I was trying to teach you. Emma read the letter slowly, occasionally looking up at me with tears in her eyes. When she finished, she folded it carefully and put it in her purse. Grandma, this is beautiful, and you're right that I understand what you were trying to tell me. I learned it by watching how you handled everything that happened with Mom and Dad and Uncle Michael. You showed me what it looks like to stand up for yourself while still treating people with dignity. That's the most important lesson I could teach you. I'm going to keep this letter forever, and someday, if I have children, I'm going to show it to them, so they understand what it means to be a good family member. As I sat in my living room that evening after Emma had gone home, I reflected on the journey I'd taken over the past 3 years. I'd lost some relationships, but gained others. I'd discovered strengths I didn't know I had, and learned to value myself in ways I never had before. I'd protected my future and my grandchildren's futures while teaching important lessons about accountability and consequences. Most importantly, I'd learned that love without boundaries isn't actually love at all. It's enabling. Real love sometimes requires difficult choices and painful consequences. Real love means caring enough about people to hold them accountable for their actions, even when it's easier to just let things slide. My children had taught me that lesson through their absence. My grandchildren had confirmed it through their presence, and I had learned to live it through the choices I'd made to protect myself and the people I truly cared about. As Rusty settled beside my chair for the evening, I felt a deep sense of contentment. I was 70 years old, healthy, financially secure, and surrounded by people who genuinely loved and respected me. I had meaningful work, authentic relationships, and a clear sense of my own worth. It had taken a cancer diagnosis and the worst Christmas of my life to get here, but I'd finally learned how to build a life based on mutual respect, rather than one-sided sacrifice. And that, I realized, was the best gift I could have given myself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.